I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This is an interesting one. I had a really long and engrossing conversation with Daniel Cowper, whose name, I guess if it's pronounced like the poets, then it might be Cooper, but he's a poet. He is an essayist, and I specifically I'm talking to him this week because of his essay, Why Don't People Like Poetry? What Poetry Do They Like?, which came out recently in New Verse Review. He is also the author of Kingdom of the Clock, a novel in verse out now from McGill Queen's University Press. He starts the essay by talking a little bit about, what it's felt like publishing that novel, but it quickly gets into the question, exactly the questions that are identified in the title. Part of what I really appreciated about this essay was the straightforwardness and I think good faith of it. It also made a kind of an argument for, a little bit, around the way, but we got in this conversation, we directly got into this question of whether poetry should be didactic. And if you have listened to this podcast for more than 5 minutes, you know how I tend to feel about that. But part of why I really wanted to talk to Daniel was that I thought he made a really thoughtful argument for, he made a thoughtful case that I don't agree with, but that I think was really worth hearing out and thinking through. This is very much a two-parter. I broke it off, I think, at a reasonable enough place, but I think it's, the second half is if anything, it's sort of even more in the weeds. We even more directly address what we disagree about. It does get slightly more personal in that Daniel draws, a little more from his own life and experience, but this is really just a full-on 2 hour plus conversation trying to answer this question: should poetry be didactic? And mostly because I've already said plenty about that, I tried to draw out his argument, and I think it's a very good one. I think Daniel's very thoughtful, very smart, very much worth listening to. My suspicion is that this will be divisive, in that a certain number of you will really enthusiastically agree with Daniel and think that there's almost no point in any of my objections. And then a certain number of you will think it's insane of me to give him the time of day and to hear him out. I disagree with both of you. I think it's a conversation worth having, but I suspect that this will inspire some strong feelings. And for all those reasons, I thought it would be a lot of fun to do this episode. So I do hope you'll enjoy it. And to hear the second half, go to sleerickets.substack.com, put your email address in the slot, and I will give you a week's access for free. After that, it's really fucking cheap. I keep threatening to raise the monthly rate. I will do that at some point soon. But it's still quite cheap. It will still be pretty cheap even then. Before getting to the conversation I had with Daniel Cowper, though, I did want to mention a couple other recent publications. Two by Sunil Iyengar. He recently very kindly reviewed my chapbook, The Soft Black Stars, in New Verse Review as well. Same magazine that ran Daniel's essay. I don't read reviews. I haven't read this one, but I've heard it's smart. And I'm not at all surprised by that, because I have also edited Sunil. Another one of the essays I wanted to point you to was his recent piece on not knowing how to start, which is precisely addressing that question when it comes to starting a poem, talking about what it might mean to be inspired and how one might go about trying to pursue inspiration. I know that the essay on not knowing how to start is very much worth reading, because I read it, reread it, and edited it with him. And the review of the Soft Black Stars, I assume, is worth reading because Sunil is generally worth reading. And I tried to make a pretty good chapbook. So there is that. I also wanted to point you to a recent essay by Zina Gomez-Liss, friend of the show, she posted something called What He Really Wanted From Me, a personal story of literary mentorship gone very wrong. And it is It's a reflection from Zena's own life, but it's a direct response to the previous episode of this podcast. She quotes from it a little bit, refers to it, the conversation that Alice and Nida and I had about Ellen Bryant Voigt's, about the Rachel Jameson Webster essay about her relationship with Ellen Bryant Voigt. Juicy if frustrating essay of Webster's, excellent essay of Zena's, and I go back and listen to the conversation with Alice and Nida if you have not yet heard it. All right, enough of that. Do remember to go to check out The Secret Show, where you can hear the second half of this episode. You can hear a new episode every week, some almost 200 episodes already up. And if you are a Secret Show paid subscriber, you can send in a poem for listener crit, a frank, anonymous critique on the podcast. I'm a little overdue. I have a few of those coming up very soon, but go check all that out at SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Now, here is my conversation with Daniel Cowper, author of Why Don't People Like Poetry? What Poetry Do They Like? As well as the novel in verse Kingdom of the Clock.
I should answer your question about Canadian poetry. So Canadian poetry is much more inflected by British poetry and by British literature and the British academic culture, because, of course, all of literature now is infected by academic culture, academic expectations. So there's more of that. There is also more French influence.
Okay.
So even in like Anglo Canada, like out here on the West Coast, everybody takes French in school. Everybody has some kind of connection to the French language. If I'd done a PhD, it probably would have been in Old French literature.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think those factors create a different character. When we look at American poetry from a Canadian perspective,
yeah, what does it look like to you?
The kind of public square rhetoric of it is really noticeable.
Okay.
A lot of it sounds like stump speeches. A lot of it sounds like somebody on a soapbox.
Totally.
Or somebody at a political convention giving a speech. And those rhetorical habits seem so ingrained to us, and it's something that's not very natural to us. Canadian poetry, I mean, is it doesn't usually go far enough, so it can be too. Its problem is that it's Canadian poets tend to be afraid to kind of be ambitious, be artistically, be like aesthetically ambitious, be ambitious in terms of their content. They know that they'll be rewarded. The Canadian literary culture rewards certain kinds of expression, right? So if you want to write about your immigrant experience,
Sure.
if you want to write about your experience as a sexual minority, or as to some degree as an ethnic minority, and nowadays, especially if you want to write about your experience as an Indigenous person,
sure, yeah,
those sorts of things get rewarded independently of literary quality. So there's obviously there's good writing that fits into those categories, but then there's also very bad writing that gets rewarded just as much as the good writing for fitting into the categories.
That much is pretty true here, I think, as well. I think we are it cuts across a number of different categories, but I think we are much in the habit here of celebrating the poet over the poem.
Yeah, totally.
It was funny, Steve, after your I talked to Steve Knepper, who does the New Verse Review, and was very kindly introduced us. But after he sent the email connecting us, he sent me a message saying he noticed that I think you did a good job of talking about a number of very popular top-selling poets today. But one that you left out was Joseph Massey, who's come up on a previous episode of the podcast, who's again like he's a trailblazer in a way, because we, as you pointed out, like we are big on stump speech poems here, and for a long time that mode has been dominated by progressives, but bad conservative poetry is on the rise, competing with bad progressive poetry, and Joseph Massey is a great example of a very mediocre self-righteous stump speech poet who's representing the MAGA interests on and selling very well, apparently. But
people are hungry right now. I honestly think people have. I think writers tend to have a lot of internal resources, you know?
Yes,
And I don't mean to like talk us up. I don't mean to
contrarian,
talk,
yeah, but
I don't mean to like talk us up, but I mean like we tend to have read a lot. We tend to have thought quite a lot. We tend to be quite well educated. We tend to also be quite independently minded. So we tend to have been more intentional with our lives. We tend to have been more, we tend to feel more comfortable kind of making up our own minds about things. Maybe that's an illusion because I live on an island in the middle of the woods.
I was gonna say you seem like very I was gonna say again very level and well thought through. I was gonna say my own life feels like very poorly considered, but yeah, I was gonna say if nothing else, writers probably have read more books than most people and
Yeah, so
have an easier time coming up with the justifications for our beliefs, whether or not they're actually justified.
yeah, but they had, I mean, if they remember the books that they've read, they have a lot of internal resources. They have a lot of kind of mental tools to think about things. And I think that that is increasingly rare in the general population, and especially in the youngest generation when you look at the teenagers and the people in their 20s. It is remarkable how many of them just don't have those kinds of basic tools to think about their lives, think about things that are happening to them, to think about what they want in life, think about what matters to them. And they're really hungry for somebody to tell them this is what life is about. You know, this is okay, this is not okay. This is good, this is not good. And I think they're so hungry for it. Almost anything that's accessible, something that they can digest, they'll go for, you know?
Yeah.
And in a way, MAGA is a reflection of that. I think we're seeing a lot of like
Even like your fellow countryman Jordan Peterson, a lot of his popularity seems to be like
oh, absolutely.
lost young men who want some like very very basic and obvious advice about cleaning your room.
Yeah. Yeah, they need to be told.
Right. Yeah.
They need to be told, live your life with purpose. Figure out what you want and then go and get that thing. That's fine. You don't have to feel bad about it. That's a good thing to do. And it's one of those things, it's so basic. I don't know what dads are doing. Honestly, like I have two kids and I feel like I'm always trying to tell them, I was telling them last night, I was telling them, like, if you pretend to be scared of everything, you will become scared of things. If you pretend to be brave, you will become brave. If you pretend to be sluggish, you will feel more sluggish. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I was gonna say, I feel like I spend most of my time with my daughter saying, like, if you don't brush your hair every day, it will have a lot of snarls in it. Please brush your hair every. Please
oh, do
wash
you
your
have
hands.
girls?
Please. I have two girls, yeah. So it's a
Okay.
lot. I just feel like basic physical maintenance is like the majority of my life these days. Please
How
change
old
your
are your
underwear
girls?
every day. They're 8 and 12.
8 and 12. Okay. So I have a one just turned 5, one just turned 7.
Okay, all right.
So I'm a little bit
And but
behind
I
the
was gonna
curve.
say, but you're already more philosophically advanced than we are. I feel like we're just spinning our wheels trying to get through the day.
Well, I don't know if I am, but I notice bad habits developing and I don't like to see that, you know?
Hmm.
I see, and to some degree this is determined also by your spouse, right?
Hmm.
My wife is more anxious than I am, and so it pays for me to be proactive about things. Because if I'm proactive about an issue with the kids by saying things like don't cultivate this habit because it's going to become harder and harder to get rid of as time goes by, then I can hopefully get ahead of the thing and then it doesn't start to bother my wife and she doesn't start worrying about it. But yeah, I mean that's a little factor, but
I feel like the my joke to my brother was that before my daughters were born, I assumed raising kids would be like designing a utopia, and after they were born, I learned it's like surviving a zombie apocalypse. You just like, can we keep the windows boarded for another night before they get in? It's just getting through, man. Just trying to survive.
so I will also say I don't know what is it like in the part of North Carolina where you live? Are you in a more rural area or more urban?
It's funny because we're in a small town. It's about 20,000 people, but it's adjacent to a number of universities, so it's not really a representative small town in the South. It's very here we blue means liberal or Democrat, and red means Republican. So it's like a blue dot and a red C. So
Mm.
you get in a way like there's a certain kind of like progressive over. I mean, I'm a as I've said plenty of times, I'm myself a dumb lefty atheist, but like I get overdosed on progressive platitudes all the time. Like every
They're going to
house in our
radicalize you.
neighborhood had a in this house we believe sign, except for ours. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I think like then I speak to liberal friends of mine who live in other areas, and they have like a lack of understanding of religious or traditional or
Mm.
conventional ways of life or perspectives that to me is just like you can't live here and not
Mm.
understand certain things. So I feel like I have a relatively decent. I have a pretty good time understanding where most people are coming from
Mm.
culturally and politically. I just disagree with everybody. But yeah, it's like a there's it's a this is like a very family friendly town that is more self-consciously woke, progressive, liberal than most, but at the same time is still pretty heavily influenced by traditional Southern Christian culture.
Mm.
So like
Mm.
it's a sort of town where you like everybody would say it's what a wonderful thing to be a stay-at-home dad, but then like almost nobody actually is one, and they quietly look down on it, right? So it's sort of both and.
I mean, that sounds like a really nice place, honestly.
No, it's a great place to raise kids. It's a little dull to be an adult here, but yeah, it's a great place
Okay.
to raise kids.
Okay. So we live on an island
Mhm.
with about 5,000 people, less than that, really. It's probably more like 3,500. However, we're a 15-minute ferry ride away from West Vancouver.
Okay.
So I used to work downtown back when I was practicing law full time, which I only practice law part time now. But when I was practicing law full time, it would take me 45 minutes to an hour to get to the office, which is not a bad commute.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And when you keep in mind that 15 minutes of that is on a boat,
Sure.
actually pretty sweet, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So we have the benefit of a lot of kind of cultural stuff from the mainland. Like my wife is at ballet class right now. She's
Mhm.
she's off doing her ballet, which is great. But because we're secluded the way that we are, the way that we're cut off from the mainland, it's just a lovely place to have little kids, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yesterday my 5-year-old didn't have preschool. He's in his last little bit before kindergarten. So we dropped off his big brother at grade one, and then he and I walked down through the forest down to the dock by the ferry, and we went and I had a coffee and he had a cookie. And then we came back through the forest back up to the school, and he saw a bush with flowers on it. And he's like, let's get some flowers for mom. And so we there was a branch that had already been broken off, probably by a deer. And so I tore off a sprig of that. And then every flower he saw, there was a new kind of flower. He wanted to pick one for his mom so he could bring her a bouquet of flowers. And so we collected this thing of flowers and found a little bird's nest that we collected with it. We brought a bird's nest home.
So you do live in a Mary Oliver poem.
Yeah, that's ordinary life for me. That's ordinary life for me.
You
And
had a little jokey thing in your essay about like Canadian. It's a certain type of Canadian poetry that basically says like life is shitty but nature is pretty.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, not even life is shitty. It's not that level of pessimism. It's a I've been unhappy, right?
Okay, yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah.
complaint. The complaint is like, I've been feeling down,
Right.
but aren't the birds great? You know? And that's and I mean, I laugh at it because I think it's a lazy poem, but that is a consolation,
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
know? It is a consolation to be
Yeah.
like, oh, look at the birds flying. Isn't that great? You know? And there's all sorts of poems about that I can't write because I feel like they're too lazy, but like nature is so beautiful and it is so like in here, where we live, it's like this is how nature comes out of the box, pretty much. It does offer consolation, it does offer encouragement. I think, Mary Oliver, she's writing for people who kind of don't live that, but
Yeah,
need
yeah,
to be
yeah.
reminded. you know? Need to be reminded like there are birds that fly through the sky, you know? You don't fly unless you buy a ticket, but you're walking on this earth just like the little bird is, you know? Give yourself a break.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's not sophisticated, but there's a way in which it doesn't have to be, especially this is something I said in the essay actually, which is maybe I didn't say it in an essay, but I said in a comment, just a bunch of comments on this thing.
Hmm.
Somebody was saying like, is this really wisdom? This stuff that people are offering in these poems. Is this really wisdom?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had the same
And
question.
that's
Yeah.
that is a good question. And that's something that I struggled with a little bit. When I was first writing it, of course, I like couldn't help. I was having fun with it, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah.
having fun with the stuff,
It's a
so I
you know,
couldn't
it's a
help but
very breezy essay. It's very fun, easy read. Yeah.
yeah. So of course, I couldn't help but like take some comedy shots
Sure.
at
Yeah.
the stuff that was on offer. But I really dialed that stuff back when I edited it because it's just it's very distracting to critique the philosophy that's on offer, you know?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
you miss the point when you start critiquing the value of what's being offered. And I also think that if you keep in mind like who's reading this, these teenage kids, like I met this like
This
It's
being
like a
like
14-year-old
Instagram
who's
poems
like, "Oh,
mostly.
you're a poet. I want to be a poet." So yeah, I met a 14-year-old who was like, "Oh, you're a poet. That's so I want to be a poet. I love poetry." And I was like, "Oh, what poets do you like?" And she was like, "Oh, these poets. You've probably never heard of them. They're on TikTok." That 14-year-old, like, she doesn't need something super sophisticated. What she needs is like she needs basic stuff. She needs to be told about how birds are pretty, and how that's a consolation. She needs to be told that like the Haley Grace thing. Like I find Haley Grace very difficult on a personal level because I don't care for the
I was gonna
I
say
don't
I don't
care.
care. I didn't care for any part of her writing, but yeah,
Yeah, and
but it's not for me. Yeah.
in particular, I really worry about the wisdom of reinforcing the validity of kind of suicide ideation. I don't like young women in beautiful dresses talking about how they're always thinking about killing themselves, you know? Like I don't like she makes herself she gets all pretty and she goes on her
Mm.
Instagram and she talks about how she was thinking about killing herself, but then she decided not to. I really worry that that's not helpful to people because it encourages them to think about suicide too much.
So I do want to like back up and get just provide a little more context for sort of how we're getting talking about this because I think you take a really interesting path into the essay that
Mm.
you sort of start with some it's very much a way there's a part of me that feels like every essay on poetry should be an essay on like the basics. We should always be going back to the basics. And so I really
Yeah,
appreciate you start with some very simple, obvious questions and then try to answer them honestly.
mm.
You start sort of talking about you've got this book that just came out, The Kingdom of the Clock, novel and verse. Great, by the way. Like, I mean, I complained so much about bad book design. Really beautiful cover. But yeah, so you've got this book coming out. It's you're happy with it. It's done. It's done well enough. But you point out the obvious that any book of serious poetry is unlikely to sell very many copies. But it invites a question like, okay, so do any books of poetry sell a lot of copies? And if so, what are they? There's plenty that people seem not to like about poetry. And you make, I think, a very worthwhile point that you say poets periodically try to diagnose what went wrong and why is poetry so unpopular and to identify the one cool trick that will bring back poetry's audience. Some say poets must go back to the relatable exhibitionism of the confessional poets or politicized urgency of the beats. Others that we must return to the passionate erudition of the modernists. Others that we must go back to the traditional forms, meters, and subject matter that preceded modernism if we want to please readers. You say, in my opinion, it is impossible to give a completely satisfying answer because for every valid reason to dislike poetry, there is an opposite and equally valid reason to dislike it. Whatever quality of poetry, whether it's too sloppy or too staid, whether it's too emotional or too impersonal, all all of those opinions are held, and all of them have validity to them. And so then the question is, all right, so if there are a lot of different reasons you could dislike poetry, and it's hard to say what one big mistake poetry made, then we can just ask, well, okay, well, what poems do people like? What poetry do people like? So you look at very successful poetry and say, all right, well, there's a variety of it, and I think you're very reasonable in your approach to discussing it, which is to say you identify what are the most popular poets, and Amanda Gorman is the first one you talk about. This Haley Grace is another Instagram poet. Lucas Jones is another Instagram poet. Bell Hooks is better known in across academic circles and elsewhere. And you talk about the other, like my joke about FSG was that if you wanted, like, statistically, if you wanted to get published at a prestigious poetry publisher as a white guy in America, you should publish in FSG because they publish way out of proportion. They publish way more white guys than are part of the population. The only catch is you have to be a already famous dead white guy. Like, if you're Rilke or Eliot or Dante, you're definitely getting published. But you talk about basically, like, what are the popular poets today? What are the dead poets who are also popular today? And you talk about some of their individual poems, including a couple Haley Grace poems. But then you sort of come to an interesting conclusion about what, despite all their differences, what they all have in common. And I appreciate, like with Amanda Gorman, I didn't even know she did a Super Bowl poem, which I only saw it because you mentioned it. And I think you're very fair in your assessment of her, which is, you see, Gorman's work is often judged unfairly because verse like this is written to be used as a voiceover for an inspirational montage. That her poetry is almost always meant to be a fully audiovisual experience, and that she's a perfect personal telegenic vehicle for that. That, like, you can complain that it's not the kind of poetry you like. It's not the kind of poetry I like, but it is a pretty successful version of itself. It is pretty successfully doing what it sets out to do. And that this is true to varying degrees for for these other very popular poets. Even if you don't like it, even if you can argue it's not good, which I tend to think is the case, people do genuinely like it. And so that is worth considering. It's worth considering, all right, what is it that they really like? And your interesting conclusion is that what seems to be pretty consistent across not only these very popular Instagram poets or spoken word poets, popular poets today, but also a lot of the canonical poets who are very popular today. What seems to be a pretty consistent element across these poems is they have an ostensibly didactic component, that they are presenting or purporting to present wisdom of some kind. I want to let come back to Haley Grace, but I wanted to at least give people a sense of sort of what was the larger vision of the essay and how we got into these particular examples. Is there anything in that broad summary that you want to amend or add to or modify?
I didn't. I also pointed out that lots of great canonical poetry is not didactic.
Right. It doesn't have to be didactic.
It doesn't have to be didactic. I only wanted to observe that a lot of the didacticism is not poisonous to great poetry. There are lots of great poems that would be really lessened if you took the didacticism out of them. They wouldn't be remembered with the same amount of affection, and they wouldn't be as beautiful as they are if you took the didactic ingredient out. That's the point that I wanted to make about the great poets. But I thought what was so interesting about Haley Grace and Lucas Jones and even Amanda Gorman is that all of them are trying to say clearly something that people really want to hear, and that they need to hear in some sense. I think it's an insight not only into an appetite for poetry, but I think into where we are as a culture in terms of the lack of a philosophical or spiritual framework for the younger generation to help them in life and give them a sense of meaning and
is that new though? Is that peculiar to this moment? Because it seems like that's always been pretty popular, right? Like poetry that offers kind of a common, familiar, comforting wisdom is that's pretty timeless.
I think it's always been a need that young people have to receive guidance. And I don't know if you remember being 18 years old and reading,
Yeah.
but I loved it when I was a teenager and I was reading something and the author would just tell me something that I didn't know about the world, even if it was something very simple, because you don't know much when you're a kid. And if a writer tells you something like a whale has an eye that looks like a bullock's eye, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. Now I know that. Or if
Is that
or
didactic?
no, that's not, but it is instructive. It is instructive. And I think that didacticism is sort of a kind of it's a kind of moral instruction, right? And I think young people need instruction, moral as well as factual. The great Kipling poem that Victoria Moole referred to.
It was
I don't know if
on
that
my
makes it.
wall as a kid throughout my whole boyhood.
So that's an interesting example. So you had that on your wall. I
Yep.
can't remember not knowing that poem. And
This is
how
if
would you
for people who might have, yeah.
yeah. So how would you say having that poem on the wall when you were a kid affected you?
It provided a rhetorically potent, mnemonically indelible new weapon for my ongoing campaign of self-loathing. It provided another standard by which I could be perpetually disappointed in myself. I mean, I received so much moral instruction growing up Catholic in a Catholic school, in a Catholic community, in a Catholic Sunday school. I mean, I went to the school I went to was also the church, was also where all my family was. I didn't know non-Catholics for the first, 15 odd years of my life, except for a couple of, friends of my family. I received so much moral instruction. Almost every aspect of my life involved moral instruction. By the time I was 18, I definitely was profoundly allergic to it. But
Mm.
I think then as now, I tended to receive any morally instructive or opinionated writing both with resentment and as a new opportunity for discovering a way that I could despise myself. So I think like that's truly been the role it's played my whole life. I have such a powerful aversion to didacticism in literature that part of what I really appreciated about your essay was that I think it was trying to answer these questions in a very matter of fact and honest and simple, straightforward way. And it clarified for me what is happening, I think, in some didactic poems. That in fact, there may be part of what I came away from your essay thinking was, oh, we may have been too broad, we may have been too credulous in accepting that these are all didactic poems, that the poems tell us they're didactic.
Mm.
But I wonder if they all are, because I thought about like the Haley Grace poem. So we should just here's the first bit of a Amanda Gorman poem. This is from her Super Bowl poem. I just watched it right before we spoke, and it was like three citizens I had not heard of. I guess they were celebrated in some context, but they were, all people who had contributed significantly to their community and, dealing with kids, dealing with athletics, dealing with medicine. They were all, people making a real difference in their community. She kind of, there's a montage of them doing some things, a montage of her presenting her poem, and she's very good at doing this and looks great on camera and is great at, gesturing and wearing her costume. And the whole poem was just saying, what a wonderful thing these people are doing. We should honor them. And then it concludes, you quote, with the lines, "We celebrate them by acting with courage and compassion, by doing what is right and just. For while we honor them today, it is they who every day honor us." And setting aside, any kind of critical assessment of those lines, they are ostensibly telling us something we don't know about these people. What I didn't know about those people was that they existed. And I think like anytime I get to learn about some people doing some good things for their community, great, that's wonderful. But that's not what her poem is purporting to tell us. Her poem is purporting to offer an insight about how we should think of them and ourselves. And I guess my observation reading that and my feeling reading a lot of the poems you quoted was this is not actually an insight. Like setting aside the question of whether it's good wisdom or whether it's profound wisdom, I think it's not really, I don't think it's actually instructing anybody. I think it is affirming or reassuring, or even just providing the experience of feeling like you're receiving a wisdom or a nice lesson. I think that's so often the case with poetry readings, that whether they're explicitly didactic poems or not, the sound that most people make at poetry readings when things are going well is mm. And that sound is not saying, that's not the sound of, oh shit, oh, that's something new. Oh, I've been affected. It's a sound of like having being reaffirmed, being reassured, being so told, having the feeling that you were being taught something. And I don't mean this to disparage, because I think that's true of like plenty of great poems. Neither are they really instructing us. I think they're often, that instruction is almost the formal occasion of the poem. And the actual
Hmm.
effect of it is to produce a certain kind of feeling. And sometimes
Hmm.
that feeling is a bait and switch. Sometimes it's like, Horace will use the occasion of Cleopatra's death to begin what purports to be a rousing patriotic poem about conquering the enemy. And by the end, it seduces you into realizing like, oh, there's actually something really admirable in Cleopatra. Right. Sometimes
Hmm.
he'll present like very, very familiar wisdom in a way that is, there's nothing surprising in the the reassurance. Oh, there are plenty of fish in the sea, but there is a feeling of comfort or consolation or pleasure or humor in the way he gets there. And I think similarly in some of these poems by the Instagram poets, by Amanda Gorman or Mary Oliver, I think that you make a very, very good point in reading this. You're talking about Mary Oliver's poem Wild Geese. You say, are you anxious about how you drift through life with no purpose but your own pleasure? Mary Oliver is there to tell you to do whatever feels good and help you feel good about doing it. Well, so that's not even purporting to be wisdom, right? That's saying like that's giving you the feeling of getting to keep it's basically it's reassuring you in thinking what you already thought. And I don't disparage that either, but I think that is distinct. It may be saying that it's offering wisdom. It may be said in a way that is as if offering wisdom. But I think formally you could even say it's offering wisdom. But I think the effect that it has on the reader is something slightly different.
So I think so I'll comment a couple of those points.
Yeah, yeah.
The Amanda Gorman poem, I think fundamentally is about holding up certain people as paragons
Mm-hmm.
and saying that we should emulate them. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's the idea. Now, should we emulate them through our actions, or should we emulate them through a kind of momentarily honoring these people and feeling like in doing so we vicariously participate in their virtue? I mean, that's
Yeah,
a you could criticize it from that perspective,
yeah. While we honor them
but
today, it is they who every day honor us. Really saying here are your flowers. Now you keep doing the hard work you're doing.
I think though that it can be a bit distracting to critique the validity of the point being made, because the core of the point that she is making is these people are paragons, and they're not. I would say this people, the fact that you hadn't heard of them is kind of the point.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
point
yeah.
is not to say these individuals are in some way above all other individuals, but to say that the way that these people have been serving society is praiseworthy and deserves deserves our special honor, but it also calls us to participate in their virtues in our own walks of life. That's, I think, what the poem says. It's not much of a reach, but it is offering in pretty clear and explicit terms a thought which was not necessarily present in the mind of the person who heard it before they saw the montage and heard the words, you
So
know?
the like partly that if there's something that cuts against the grain in this poem or in this, really video essay, it's that the people you're mostly seeing celebrated right now watching the Super Bowl are athletes, singers, actors, people who are celebrated for very different kinds of accomplishments and who receive a great deal of sort of public acclaim. These are people who are making a difference in their communities in ways that are not especially glamorous and not especially high profile, and yet they're worthy of our great esteem.
Yeah,
That sort of, if there's, because in order to be instructive, you have to be to some degree offering an exception, offering something against the grain. You can't
yeah.
simply say things should should carry on exactly the way they are.
I think to some degree, people speak into a vacuum. There is a certain emptiness in our society at the moment, I think. And one of the things that she's trying to do is just say, "Oh, look at these people who are doing good work. They're doing good work in a good way, and we could be like them. You could be like these people, and that would be a good thing." It's not as you say, it's not cutting against the grain to say that people should emulate people who do good work well. But nonetheless, that's something which is not necessarily thought clearly by everybody all the time. And with the example of Mary Oliver, what she's doing is she's affirming a practice, but she's giving you a thought to capture that practice in. Almost by definition, the person who is moved deeply by her poem about the wild geese is somebody who has not really reflected on their life, but feels a kind of dissatisfaction with how things are going and feels a kind of an absence, the absence of reflection. And then when Mary Oliver offers that reflection and and she offers it as against a more traditional self-sacrificing morality, right? She says, you do not have to sacrifice yourself. You do not have to drag yourself through the desert. And by implication, like you were taught in Catholic school, or I mean, I don't know. I didn't go to Catholic school.
Yeah,
I
misery is good. Misery is best. Is sort of the
Yeah,
philosophy.
she says, the people have tried to teach you that misery is good and that self-sacrifice is good. No, you don't have to do that. You can live for yourself like the way that the birds do. And that is a valid thing to do because you are a wild animal and you need to pursue your own appetites. That is a thought that she is offering, which captures a lifestyle, but a lifestyle which is generally not going to be highly reflective and is not going to have thought about itself in that way. So the thought that she offers, while affirming the act, may still come very new and fresh to the people who have been living out that path for many years.
So that's, I'm trying to think, because like if I in like my dumb guy distinction, I would maybe say that if lyric if didactic writing offers a solution, lyric writing offers a consolation. But you're suggesting that there's a way in which a consolation can be instruction as well. Like saying that the thing you felt and the thing you've been inclined toward, it's okay. And here's a way for you to think that thought consciously, that can still be, you would still consider that didactic.
It's a form of teaching. Yeah, I do think so. And a form of moral instruction. So, yeah, I do
Yeah.
think it can be didactic.
Okay. So
I think
it
it's
does seem like
interesting.
there's yeah. Go ahead.
I should say, Matthew, in terms of our backgrounds, I grew up on Bowen Island, which was a total hippie enclave when I was
Mm.
growing up in it. So I grew up in a real vacuum in terms of moral instruction.
Okay. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't something that was pushed in our culture. And generally speaking, out here on the West Coast, it wasn't pushed, I think. So
So,
I had a
that
very
your West Coast is like our West Coast in that respect.
even more so,
Yeah.
even more
All
so.
right.
So up in Canada, so British Columbia, the father of British Columbia, Governor Douglas, was a half Caribbean guy who found himself running the new colony of British Columbia, and nobody back in England knew he was black until So they sent a guy, this is in the 19th century,
Yeah, yeah,
they
yeah,
sent a naval figure out here to sort of check on how things were going. And he was scandalized that the province was being run by a black guy. He invited a bunch of black Americans to basically come up as refugees after the American Civil War.
yeah.
Um, so the kind of progressive
Yeah,
cultural
yeah, yeah.
impetus here goes right back to the beginning. We had the first premier of British Columbia in the 19th century, so I guess about 1870. He changed his name legally to Amor de Cosmos to express his personal
Oh,
philosophy
it's
of
very sweet.
generally
Yeah,
loving ever being the sort of
yeah,
universal love figure. So that's the cultural context that I come from.
right.
And it's a very different, more individual, and I think also less theory burdened, maybe
Yeah,
background from
yeah, yeah.
yours. But so when I say, like, I remember being a kid and having somebody say, "Oh, it's good to," like in the Kipling poem "If," that something to aspire to is perseverance,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And I mean, really the theme of "If" is the core of masculinity as he describes it. The core of masculinity is the ability to persevere despite failure, despite discouragement, and without complaint.
Right.
And that's a kind of moral instruction which can be certainly rejected or accepted. I think many people have found it burdensome to be told you can't complain.
Yeah, I think it can also be over taught. I think you can. I
Totally.
think. I think. Keep suffering and don't complain about it has led. In fact, one might argue to a global like sex abuse scandal over many centuries. But yeah, yeah. I mean, among other things, it's a. I think there's certainly great wisdom there, and again, I still admire a great deal the kind of the British stiff upper lip ideal of the that's expressed in that poem. Yeah, it's not always good advice.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about moral instruction, I mean, I think something which may be more thoughtful but less accessible wisdom is going to do is it's going to take the wisdom of you should be able to persevere despite whatever obstacles and setbacks you face. And it's going to set that off against it is okay to take a rest, and it is okay to seek consolation, and it's okay to ask for help. That's another kind of wisdom, you know? We have a book for the kids called Brundabar. Do you know that?
No, no, no.
Maurice Sendak illustrated it, but it was written by Kushner, the guy who wrote Angels in
Oh,
America.
Tony Kushner. Okay.
Yeah, Tony Kushner.
All right.
So he wrote it. It's based on a children's opera which was performed in a concentration camp by the Jewish children who were there.
Is this what's the named after the Empress? What's the one? Theresienstadt.
Oh, okay. Do you know the book that I'm talking about?
No, I know. I'm assuming that the there's a one of the concentration camps had a lot of kids in it, and there's a lot of art that survived from that camp because it was
Okay.
used as a model camp by the Nazis when they were
Yeah,
trying to fool the Red
yeah.
Cross.
Right, exactly. So the book is all about this. So there's these children who are trying to get milk for their mother because their mother is sick. And the doctor says, get some fresh milk for her. Fresh milk is the thing for somebody who is sick. Again, this is instruction, right?
Hmm.
And then the children go to town to go and buy milk. They don't have any money. And people say, no money, no milk. And they think, well, how can we get money? And they try to sing, they try to busk because they see a busker named Brundabar who's making a lot of money. But the busker is offended by them trying to cut in
Yeah, yeah.
on his scene. So he scares them and he chases them off and they go and they hide. And then a wise dog tells them what to do when you are few. Ask for help, get more of you. And so they ask for help, and other children come. All the children from the school come, and they all sing, and they sing for money. And the children use the money to get milk, and they take it back to their mom. And one of the things that it says what's hard is to know when to ask for help. That is wisdom, you know, in this little children's book. And I think that's a wisdom which you hold in tension with the wisdom of Kipling's if. But you can't swallow both of those things at the same time. You know, so I don't want to criticize either Kipling's if or Brundabar. I mean, maybe Brundabar doesn't offer enough encouragement to be independent, enough encouragement to stand on your own 2 feet and to do what you can do by yourself, because it doesn't stress that. And I do think if you're going to offer good moral instruction, it should combine those things which are intention, because that's that's just how life works. You know, one of the things that I thought about putting into the essay and I didn't put in is, you know, I made that little crack about how for every reason to hate poetry, there's another complementary reason to hate poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is just an application of the principle of the golden mean, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, this is
And or the principle of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You know, one poem that I really like is Geoffrey Hill's Genesis, which I wrote about in a different essay for New Verse Review. But I love how in that poem he takes you through the thesis, antithesis, synthesis process. Do you know the poem that I'm
I'm trying
talking
to
about?
remember it because I know I read it with Cameron at one point. I'm pulling it back up.
Okay. So it
Yeah,
begins,
yeah,
so
yeah.
the frame of it is the 7 day creation.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it begins with on the first day as I rode in haste about the word. Sorry, I'm actually getting the days transposed there. I'm skipping to the fifth day. But the first day, against the burly air I strode, crying the miracles of God. And then he sees predation. So in the first day, he sees creation and the flowering of life. And then in the second day, he sees predation. He sees the osprey plunge with triggered claw, feathering blood along the shore to lay the living sinew bare. He says, so on the third day, I cried, beware the soft-voiced owl, the ferret's smile, the hawk's deliberate stoop in air, cold eyes and bodies hooped in steel, forever bent upon the kill. So this is this point where he's saying the cruelty of predation and the cruelty of the way that life feeds on life is this terrible thing, this terrible flaw in the world. And so he says, so I renounced on the fourth day this fierce and unregenerate clay, building as a huge myth for man, the watery Leviathan, and made the long-winged albatross scour the ashes of the sea, where Capricorn and Zero cross, a brooding immortality. But then he finds that kind of ideal, deathless world that he's invented, because it is bloodless, it doesn't have a purpose, it doesn't have a point, it lacks the energy of the real living world. So then the antithesis, so he has this thesis and antithesis. So that you have this idea of like, well, you have this world where this cruelty takes place. Well, now we can have this world without cruelty. But if you have that, then you don't really have the kind of exuberance that you really see in the real world of life. And so he ends by saying, on the fifth day, as I rode in haste about the works of God, with spurs I plucked the horse's blood. By blood we live, the hot, the cold, to ravage and redeem the world. So there's this completion of the thought where he tries to come to a unity of approach. I think there's beauty just in that process, but it is less accessible than Mary Oliver.
Yeah, it also feels like it's a convincing evocation of an experience and a series of emotions corresponding to this particular perspective and its speaker, but I'm less convinced that it's providing coherent moral instruction. Even that
Oh,
moment of
Geoffrey
like,
Hill. Yeah.
even that moment of spurring the horse, it feels like to me that's a moment where a little flicker of revulsion at the spurring the horse, but I also I it rings true and feels right in the moment as an experience and an impulse corresponding to this voice and this series of,
Mm.
see, in the same way that like reading, reading The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber, I don't necessarily end it thinking, yeah, let's go shoot some fucking buffalo in the face. But in that moment, I'm all for him, right? My heart is completely with him, and I'm cheering him on even as he's about to face his death, because he's sort of triumphing over his own crisis in that moment. But again, it feels to me like it's a truthful evocation of character and experience, but I don't necessarily leave it feeling morally instructed in any kind of coherent, applicable way.
So Francis McComber, I mean, that's a great short story. I mean, that's a story about somebody discovering his courage, right? This is the problem. The problem that he faces is that he has not really grown up, that he is still a boy, and well, this is how Hemingway presents it, as I understand it.
That's how the English Hunter presents it. Who is the primary perspective character, but
Right,
I don't think
right.
that's the absolute reading of the story. But yeah, that is the reading one is led to, and that's part of the enjoyment of the story is seeing that development.
Yeah, and his wife, to some degree, despises him, and he despises himself because of his. So he has failed. He has failed in the face of this kind of physical danger of hunting. He has failed to overcome the fear in that situation. And so when he overcomes the fear at the end in the face of death, there's a victory in that for him, which is a real victory.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Now I'll say, I actually one of the authors who I enjoy, who's I think not very widely read, is a guy called Jim Corbett, who was a famous hunter in India in the 20s and 30s, and who was a great conservationist. So the majority of wild tigers in the world today, I believe, live in Jim Corbett National Park, and he advocated successfully, ultimately, for the preservation of animals like tigers that were regarded as too dangerous to coexist with human beings. But when he writes about the fear that people face when they're confronted by like a lion or a tiger, like a lion in Francis McCober, or a tiger or a leopard, he says you cannot prepare yourself for it. So he
Oh,
talks
really
about,
interesting.
yeah, he talks about an instance where a leopard charged some villagers who had said uh, that they wouldn't be afraid, and then the leopard charged, and they all ran for their lives. And he says, "You can't. It's not their fault.
No,
It's not their fault. They did not know what it was going to feel like to have a man-eating leopard charge at them. And when you feel it, you will know you cannot blame anybody for turning and running." So I think like Jim Corbett is a guy who offers some real knowledge when I think Hemingway is offering a bit of a simplified drama. But within the context of that story, it is I think you have to accept that Francis McComber was in some sense not fully alive until he was able to overcome his physical fear and stand his ground against the buffalo, even though ultimately his wife shoots him by accident. So his happy life is very short, right?
yeah,
His real life is just in that few moments, right?
yeah. Maybe I read it. There's a certain kind of like bourgeois misery to his life, and he and his wife, he's unhappy in his marriage, and he seems unfulfilled in certain respects, and maybe pitiable, certainly from the perspective of the hardened, sunburned, alcoholic English hunter. But really, what's happened is he's been transplanted from a domestic setting into a totally exotic and violent and alien, sporting hunting setting, and he's confronted with this crazy, again, completely foreign challenge, and he fails in it. And then in this strange moment, he's able to rise to the challenge and succeed in it. But the correspondence between that and some sort of moral worth in his life as a whole, or wisdom, or even, so to me, it's a moment in which he gets to have a win and enjoy it, and we feel that excitement with him and with the hunter, and then he gets shot at that moment. But I don't think that's because he sort of like he finally achieved himself there. I think he got a big win and felt happy in that moment. I don't know how much of a real correspondence there was between his triumph over his fear in that moment and like the larger problems in his life before. It just feels like it in, from the hunter's perspective, that's the story of his life. But the hunter's life is itself clearly very flawed and morally compromised, and he's dishonest in how he deals with the local boys who work for him, and he's sleeping with the wives of his clients, and he's they're also he's slightly cheating in how he's using the car in the hunt. So it's not like the hunter's life is itself morally coherent. It's just that for a brief moment Macomber is able to rise to the challenge of living by the moral standard of somebody else's life and feel the full pleasure of that triumph, and then his life is cut short. So as much as anything, it feels like you could read it as I think it's possible to read it as a sort of a straight ahead Kipling-esque story of macho instruction and becoming a man. I think it's also possible to read it almost as like an absurdist story of the like a senseless universe in which human experience is sort of spun through the darkness, through bright patches and dark patches, and sometimes it ends on a bright patch. I don't think that either of those would be a completely adequate reading, and part of the fun of the story is getting swept up in the hunter's perspective. But again, I guess I'm very skeptical that all of this, that in any of these cases, there's a very clear and effective moral instruction. There's an essay, you probably didn't have a chance to read it because it just came out, but there's an essay by Elijah Blumoff, whom I think you have some familiarity with, about the romantic antihero. And I think he makes a very, very strong case, one I disagree with in many respects, but he makes a strong case that Milton and Dante in particular are playing a very sophisticated game in how they attempt to achieve moral instruction in their respective epics. And I think it's a pretty convincing argument, but again, I think I would say that the degree to which they do seem very consciously to be playing a very sophisticated game of moral instruction is the degree to which those poems fail. That in fact they tend to succeed despite themselves rather than succeeding because of the ingenious coherence of their moral instruction. I'm very, very skeptical that people genuinely receive moral instruction from poems. Sometimes poems really attempt to convey it. Sometimes poems create the impression of conveying it. Sometimes readers take morals from poems, whether or not they're there in the poem. But I think I'm very, very skeptical that often at all a poet sets out to morally instruct the reader and then succeeds in doing so.
Well, I think the examples I chose of the popular poems, those are ones where, as you say, maybe implicitly people already believe it, right? So,
or they think,
or they're looking,
yeah.
or they're looking for it in some sense. So, Haley Grace, very fundamentally, her moral instruction is to say, don't kill yourself.
Yeah.
Live on.
Don't kill yourself. You might go to Starbucks tomorrow. Is the lesson of the poem. I mean, God bless it. God bless. Yeah. Like, again, you were very fair.
Rival Starbucks in that line, and the locution of I'll buy you Starbucks is just it's a fantastic locution to see in a best-selling poem.
And you do a very fair job of not being a shit about it, just sort of like, oh, let's look at these poems, take them at face value, and see what they're actually doing. So I'm just saying, it did make me laugh.
I think it's very easy to get distracted by looking at the aesthetic qualities from a more sophisticated perspective, rather than asking the question of like, well, what is it that people are responding to here? And I think people are responding, especially like young women. I mean, there is an epidemic of mental health crisis among young women. It's absolutely astonishing, the statistics of how bad mental health has gotten among women under 25. And I mean, I think in cities, it's pushing 50% of women under 25 have been diagnosed with a mental illness.
Mm.
Young teenage girls who are in this world where they are struggling with their mental health, their friends are struggling with their mental health, for them to be told, don't kill yourself. You will look back on this time and you'll think, I was so young.
Mhm.
And also, and yet the great kind of unit. So Haley Grace's newest book has this multi-page poem that she opens with about sharing oranges with the people in her life. So instead of killing herself, she has an orange with her mom. She has an orange with her friend. She has an orange with her sister. Sharing food with other people as a way of building connection. That's a great thing to do. That's a great thing
Yeah.
to do. And maybe and frankly, teenagers probably need to be told that these days. I don't know about what it's like down in the South. I mean, Southern hospitality is famous. The only time that I've really been in the deep South as an adult was I went to Texas. And I went to Texas and I went into it was for a wedding. A friend of mine moved to Texas and got married to a Texan girl and was given a Texan gun for
Mhm.
one of his wedding presents.
Yep. I'm big on that. I like
Yeah.
those.
But I went there and I went into a restaurant and I said to the waitress, I said, "This is the first breakfast I'll ever eat in Texas. What should I have for breakfast?" And she said, "You should have this." And then I was eating and enjoying myself, not talking to anybody, I was just eating by myself. And then on
Yeah.
the way out, a couple passed by me and said, "Hey, welcome to Texas." I said, "Oh, thanks very much. Very nice." And then when I asked for the bill, the waitress said, "Oh, no, they paid for your bill." And I was like, "Really?" And she was like, "Oh, yeah, people do that here all the time. People buy, they see somebody for whatever reason, they pick up the bill for, a couple they see out for a anniversary, or when they see veterans or they see
Mhm.
newcomers, somebody will pick up the bill." So anyway, so maybe
Yeah.
hospitality is
Yeah.
very, very alive where you are, but
That
gosh,
that
it
sounds like a
is.
slight outlier. But Texas also is, I feel like Texas is almost a separate region than the South. Like it's part of the South,
Right.
but it's really like Texas is really used to be and still is to some extent its own country. And they are very proud of being Texas. As my
Totally.
dad said, if you ever hear a Southern accent and you don't know where it's from, guess Texas. Because
Hmm.
if you guess somewhere else and you're talking to a Texan, he will be very offended.
That's it. See, there you go. That's instruction. Put that in a poem.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I didn't know that. I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
So, but up here, at least, the way that the culture has shifted over the last 20, 25 years, people have really reduced the amount to which they eat with other people. So there isn't the same culture of having people over for meals. There isn't the
Mhm.
same culture of going out for dinner together anymore. I mean, who can afford to go out for dinner anymore, right?
Right.
But it's interesting to see there's been a real pressure, like people don't invite each other over to each other's homes as much as they used to, even just from the change from before and after the pandemic, there's a
Yeah,
real
yeah,
shift.
yeah, yeah.
So being told, if you're like 16 and you're told, you know what, like if you're feeling down or if you see somebody's feeling down, like share an orange with that person or invite them to do that. That's a great tip. You know? That's a great tip.
Yeah.
And so if you abstract away from, the confused verb tenses or the kind of solipsism of a lot of it, you can really, at least I think that that people are coming to it because they're being told something that is helpful to them to hear.
I don't know if I think that because I also think that you're right that learning that you can go have a meal with somebody. I mean, there's a huge. This is again, this is part of my very didactic childhood, but that's the literal meaning of the word companion. This is somebody you share bread with. Is crucial, and that was a big part of my
Mm,
youth was going to eat with friends, going to
mhm,
and eating with family, and that I value this, and I think there's if that's an insight that changes something for you or offers you a new possibility, that's a wonderful thing. But I also think that achieving that insight doesn't necessarily correspond with somebody else setting out to instruct you. I think that very
mm,
often we achieve that insight. I mean, I think people often do learn things from books. They often learn wrong things from books in some cases, but you learn things from books all the time. But I think very seldom is it a moral lesson that the author set out to teach you? And so much more often, I find that books set out to teach a moral lesson and do almost the opposite. What I very seldom feel is, oh, I have learned a good moral lesson from this book. What I feel all the time is, as Keats would say, this book has designs upon me and is trying to give me instruction, and I resent the bejesus out of it.
I mean, I think I have similar aesthetic instincts to you on this.
Yeah.
You know, in Kingdom of the Clock, which is a long book, a long poem, which I tried to make fun. And this is, you know, part of the reason why I came to this is because, you know, I tried to write a book that I thought would be really fun for people, knowing that nobody would read it, which is, or that it'd be read by a couple hundred people, which is a facet, which is, and then in the after period when it's sort of come out and you're going, okay, it's interesting to then reflect on, like, it's interesting that we do this, that we're writing it, but in that book, I really avoid didacticism, and instead I ask a question. So there's a question that the characters ask themselves over and over again.
Yeah.
The characters over and over again ask themselves, "What's it all for?"
Mhm.
There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of characters, so that when they ask that question and they come up with answers for themselves, or can't come up with an answer for themselves, it offers you an insight into the character and the drama of the situation, rather than instruction to the character, rather than instruction to the reader. But there is a little bit of implicit instruction there, because I think that people would be better off if they asked themselves the big question of, like, what am I doing with my life? What is all of this for? I think a lot of people would be a lot better off if they asked that. And so I do, to some degree, have designs upon the reader, in that when I have when every single character at some point is forced to ask him or herself, what am I doing all of this for? What is it all for? What is the purpose of this? I'm inviting the reader to ask the same question about their life, you know, about the reader's life. What is this all for? What am I aiming at? And I think people would be better off if they gave some thought to that. I don't know if that's
But no,
I
that's
don't know
not,
if that's badly didactic, or if it's wrong to have that kind of aim. You know, you say, like, the author has designs upon you. Yeah, that's a great, I mean, that's a great phrase. But
it's
at the
Keats, of
same
course. Yeah,
time,
yeah.
all literature is to some degree about putting thoughts into somebody else's head. And obviously there are limits on the precision to which you do it. And there have to be limits. You can't, you don't want to, art wouldn't be art if it was simply mind control. But there is a dimension to it of getting somebody to think certain things. And I think there's very often purpose to that. Whether that
Yeah, yeah,
purpose
yeah.
is, pardon me,
Yeah, no, I think there is often purpose to it.
whether that purpose is instructive, the purpose to instruct or not, I think it's unavoidable to have designs upon the reader. One thing which, you know, and to just contrast it, you know, if you think about something like somebody like Sylvia Plath, in a lot of her poems, you know, a lot of her poems, they have designs upon the reader, but it's not a design of instruction. It's a design of an appeal to sympathy, where she is trying to control your sense of who she is, and she's trying to evoke your sympathy and identification. So, and sometimes enlist you in her cause, even though it is a purely personal cause.
Yeah, which I
And
also
that's
feel like is a flawed approach to writing lyric. That's me.
But that is the dominant, I would argue, the
Yeah, oh, I think it
dominant
is.
motive.
I think it is, and I think that's also a big flaw. Like, I chafe at didactic poetry. I also chafe at sort of the, you know, the pure uncut confessionalism, which I know, like, as Steve Cersei was like, what the fuck are you talking about? You just read that chapbook. I didn't mean to write a confessional chapbook, but I think to the extent to which the poem is merely like, you, the reader, consider what it is like to be me, the poet. I think that's a really flawed impulse.
I think also there's a French poet who I really like called Du Bellay, who wrote a series of poems called the Regrets. He's a 16th century French poet, one of the Pléiades. And he, if you're not familiar with him, he's fantastic. He wrote a sonnet sequence called The Ruins of Rome, which I think is a very underappreciated influence on the growth of Romanticism. It was translated into English by Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene. But his poems, The Regrets, I meant so much to me when I was working full time as a lawyer, more than full time as a lawyer. When you're a young lawyer, you're working sometimes 100 hours a week at it, sometimes, but it's in your head all the time. And in The Regrets, he writes about having to be overburdened by his official duties. He was an officer essentially in the papal bureaucracy in Rome. So he was in exile from France and he missed his home and he was always short of money and he's always trying to borrow money and keep himself afloat. He's always dealing with problems at the office and politics and the bureaucracy and just felt the whole theme of the Regrets is that he eschews the kind of rhetorical grandeur of his friend Ronsard, and he just talks about the things that are on his mind. He just talks about what he's going through. He talks about his life. Talks about how much he misses his home. He talks about what a hassle it is at the office every day. And it meant a lot to me when I was working in an office and I was living that kind of life. And even when I was living in Toronto, which is people from Toronto love Toronto, but if you're from the West Coast and you're living in Toronto, it feels like an exile to some degree. So I think it's wrong to say that that kind of confessional poetry doesn't offer something real. It can't be great art. I think it can be great art. And I'm not trying to be prescriptive. I'm not trying to rule it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm just trying to point out that being manipulative is not something which is limited to didacticism. And
Oh,
it's
totally,
not
totally. Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's not
for
intrinsic
sure.
to didacticism either. You can have a manipulative confessional poem which fails in part because of its manipulativeness,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
just the same way that you can have the same thing with a didactic poem.
Yeah, yeah. There,
And
there
at the
are
same
many other kinds of poetry I think are bad, other than didactic poetry. This is not the only one.
Well, I mean, this goes back to my point. That goes back to the point about the golden mean that I was making before. That the real, if we're trying to talk about why people don't like poetry, there's all sorts of reasons, but all of those reasons come back to, well, it was bad, and there's
Yeah,
all kinds of different ways for a poem to be bad.
yeah,
There's the ways in which poems are most commonly bad. I mean, I would argue that the manipulative personal lyric is a very common kind of bad poem.
totally, totally. Yeah.
And if I may be forgiven for criticizing Haley Grace momentarily, I did not care for her pooping on her dad for telling her to not worry so much about the
Giving her
bullies.
like a very familiar platitudinous dad observation, which presumably he was making like while also trying to do 10 other things, and his daughter was complaining about getting bullied. He said, "Yeah, yeah, they're jealous. They like you just like it was the most innocuous sort of
Yeah, those boys are not paying attention to you
consolation."
because they hate you. They're paying attention to you because they think you're cute. That's the problem, right?
And she
It's
said, "My
like,
dad was one of my bullies too." Like, how
yeah.
is that bullying you? What are you talking about? Give him a break, man.
Yeah, terrible. So I there like how many poems have you read about where somebody's like uncle said something that was politically incorrect and how offended they were by it, Somebody's uncle made
Oh,
an
yeah.
uncalled for remark
Yeah,
and
I mean, so many poems where the main character gets to be the voice of righteous reason. Yeah, I mean that's it's incredibly tiresome. I find that very.
yeah, I mean another one which I see all the time is we all love our grandmas. We're all entitled to write a poem about how great our grandmas are one time, I think. But there's so many poems where it's about my grandma is this chthonic figure who, has this authenticity rooted in the past and tradition. And my special relationship with my grandmother gives me authenticity through her. I
Yeah.
don't know how many times I've read that. And
No, it's, yeah, extremely
they win
tiresome.
prizes. Those poems win prizes all the time. And I find them
Yeah.
very manipulative and
So yeah,
false.
same thing. You know, they it claims to authenticity through any number of different avenues, including getting very sick or going through a trauma. This, yeah, this is the very very familiar exercise and very tiresome. The the thing that I think really stands out to me about morally didactic poetry, and this is something that I kind of, I mean, I think this may just be a place of like genuine disagreement and genuine divergence in experience, is that I do feel like I know what it's like to have your heart broken. I do feel like I know what it's like to feel nostalgia or to feel tenderness toward your child, or any number of nuanced complicated emotions, mixed feelings that need clear expression, as one
Mm.
might say. What I the number of ways in which I think I could confidently say that I know a sentence, I know for sure a sentence involving the word should. I
Mm.
think it's so limited, and it tends to be limited to very boring practical questions. Like thinking about Cameron, the 22-year-old, brilliant but also often very hot-headed young guy who works on the show with me. I feel like the wisdom I can think of that I have offered him, that I feel very confident about as somebody having 20 years of experience on him, is stuff like never take drugs if you don't know what they are, or like never punch a bouncer. They're just things that like I could put those in a poem, and maybe like in the way that there's a sort of like there's a beauty to the strangely surprising practical wisdom offered by first by Don Quixote and then by Sancho Panza in the like late segment in part two, where he actually gets to be the governor of an island after his long and it turns out that like Don Quixote has all this great wisdom on ruling, and then
Mm.
Sancho Panza is a really good ruler.
Mm.
Like there is some great practical wisdom in there, but for the most part, like if we're talking about moral instruction, I don't feel I don't feel confident that I know that. So the last thing I could do would be like, I feel often I can write a monologue in which I'm giving voice to a perspective somebody might have, and I try to do that honestly and clearly. There are even poems. I mean, I'm a fucking atheist, but there are poems I write that I think are Christian poems because I'm writing a Christian character, and I try to be true to that character.
Mm.
But I just don't feel at all confident that I know the thing that people ought to do morally, again, beyond just the most dumb basic, like, well, you want to really, when you brush your teeth, you want to make sure you get up where the gums are, like
Right.
that's
Yeah.
the kind of
Good
moral
advice.
instruction I can offer. It's not,
Good
again,
advice.
that's what I feel confident in saying, and very little else. So it may just be that this
Well,
is a
you don't,
difference in personality.
not, I mean, one of the things I say in the essay, and maybe it's helpful to reiterate it, is not all great poetry is didactic. Some great poetry is didactic,
Sure.
right? It's just some great poetry is didactic. There's that line from Randall Jarrell, which I think he applied to Wilbur actually, as he said, never goes too far, but never goes quite far enough.
Hmm.
I think for a writer, it's a very important maxim to keep in mind, that you can go too far, but you can also pull up before you've gone far enough. Both of those are temptations from, I think, a poet's perspective. It's easy to get scared of what would happen if you pushed a little bit further with an idea and made it more explicit and you made it more didactic. I think that it's easy to get scared of it because it can be a challenge to incorporate that kind of statement effectively, especially in a contemporary poetics context. But I think it is true that you limit poems when you don't let them say something true, when that would be a natural outgrowth from the line of thought in the poem. And I know I've done that. I know that I have poems where I have not said what is in the poem to say.
That was the first part of my conversation with Daniel Cowper, author of Kingdom of the Clock and Why Don't People Like Poetry? What Poetry Do They Like? Go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Put in your email address and it will give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. If you want to just go ahead and sign up, but you don't want to miss out on getting your free week, just know that for everybody who just jumps into an immediate paid subscription, I comp you a week on top of that. Like I automatically do that no matter what. So go sign up now. It is well worth it. Thank you all for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. If you want to give a little extra to the show, you can sign up to be a founding member and pay a little more every month and make a big difference. If you would really like to listen to The Secret Show, but you can't afford it, you can just write me at sleerickets@gmail.com and I will hook you up. And if you feel like giving the show a one-time donation, go to sleerickets.com, go to the upper right-hand corner, or just to the menu if you're going on your phone, and look for the button called Chip In. You can go there and make a direct donation. Not tax deductible, but very much appreciated. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.